Hey everybody, Yurie here. Now, you probably know me as that weirdo who looks at how Fate portrays its characters, then compares them to their original versions. There is certainly no shortage of characters for me to cover, and they keep adding more. But talking about characters that already exist in Fate isn't the only thing I'm interested in. I'm a history nerd. That's what got me so interested in Fate in the first place. But despite the fact that the JP version of FGO has now celebrated its 10th anniversary, there are a lot of figures from history or myth that are strangely absent from Fate. Figures who are not only worthy of being made into servants, but may prove to be quite interesting additions to the franchise. This isn't exactly a unique idea. There are plenty of fan-made servant ideas out there. But there are some people who I'd really like to see in Fate, and so I'm starting a new series of videos, Yurie's Wishlist. These videos will bring up a figure from history or myth, give a quick summary of their backstory, a few ideas for their classes, skills, and MP, before finally adding some thoughts about the kind of character they might be, and how they might interact with other, existing characters in the Fate franchise. I've got quite a few candidates for this series, but for my very first video, I think it's only proper I started off with a bang. Let me tell you a story about a man named Temujin. Now, he would later become famous under a different name, but we will get to that later. Temujin was born around 1162 CE to a chieftain named Yasuge and his second wife, Olun, a woman he had kidnapped from her husband-to-be. This sort of thing was sadly pretty common, a testament to the harshness of steppe society. And it wouldn't be long before the young Temujin would find that out firsthand. When Temujin was 8 years old, his father Yasuge had arranged a marriage between him and another tribe. It was agreed that Temujin would marry Borte, the daughter of the chieftain, but would then stay and work for the family for a few years as a dowry. But on his way back home, Yasuge was poisoned by members of another tribe, a tribe which had fought and been defeated by Yasuge in the past, and so wanted revenge. Word was sent to Temujin, but his father died before he could return home. Upon Yasuge's death, despite the fact that he had been the chieftain, nearly all of his former followers abandoned them, leaving the 8-year-old Temujin, his mother Olun, Yasuge's first wife Sochigel, and all of Temujin's siblings and half-siblings to their fate. They were forced to live off the land, foraging for berries, hunting, fishing, doing whatever was necessary to survive. For the next 7 years, the family lived as outcasts on the Mongolian steppe, with no protection, no stability, and at the mercy of whoever came across them. Temujin would find a friend and blood brother in a boy named Jamuka, but most of his encounters with outsiders were hostile. Temujin would be captured and enslaved by marauders a few times, but he would repeatedly escape and return to his family. He was still too young to fight against them. His older half-brother, on the other hand, when he tried to bully Temujin by stealing from him, Temujin teamed up with a younger sibling to murder his half-brother. It was a sign of things to come, that Temujin did not want to be at the mercy of others, not if he could do something about it. After 7 hard years as outcasts with nowhere to call home, Temujin went to go find his bride-to-be, Borte, and the two of them were married, with Borte's family giving Temujin an expensive cloak. Temujin would then use that cloak to be adopted by Togrul, also known as Ong Khan, who had been his father's comrade and blood brother. Ong Khan offered to put Temujin in charge of a band of warriors, but he declined. Since his family now had the support of a powerful chief, and with Borte as his new bride, Temujin seems to have decided that he was going to live a quiet life from here on, to have peace after such a rough childhood. But fate would not allow that. Around a year and a half later, his wife Borte was kidnapped by another tribe, the tribe of Temujin's mother, who, unable to get revenge on Yasuge, had decided to get their revenge on Yasuge's son instead. Temujin, who had been trying to lead a peaceful existence with his new family, had had enough. He approached Ong Khan and his blood brother Jamuka, raising an army of warriors to attack and get Borte back. What follows after that is a decades-long story that sees Temujin and his family go from being at the mercy of hostile raiders to himself becoming one of the most terrifying men in history. It is a story worth telling, but for the purposes of this video, I have to speed through it. After rescuing his wife, Borte, Temujin would stick with his ally, Jamuka, for a while, but would then strike out on his own after the two had a falling out. Temujin and his followers would have highs and lows, growing in power, being crushed by other clans, only to rise again stronger than before. Those who sided with Temujin or surrendered peacefully were rewarded. Those who resisted or betrayed him were shown no mercy. Step by step, he destroyed enemy clans, killed his enemies, and brought the rest into his own clan. It would take more than 2 decades, but eventually, Temujin rose from a small band of loyal followers to becoming the master of the Mongolian steppe. Having not been born into a prestigious family, Temujin promoted people based on merit rather than lineage. He was an upstart who stood against tradition, choosing instead to forge something new. The old clans were broken up, and his followers were reorganized into units of 10, who would then form into a unit of 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. Captured loot would be equally distributed, with shares guaranteed to the families of those who had been killed, to ensure that what had happened to Temujin's family would never happen again, not under his watch. The list of reforms enacted is long: a new code of laws, establishing a standard currency, tolerance for other faiths and cultures, and much more. By the time he was through, Temujin had changed Mongolia, and it would never be the same again. And nor would the rest of Eurasia, because once Temujin had united the Mongols and remade their entire society, he would then turn his attention elsewhere, to create the largest continental empire in world history. Temujin had spent his childhood living off whatever scraps he could get a hold of, his family struggling to survive. But he would spend his final decades dressed in Chinese silk and Persian gold, as too would his descendants. Temujin may have been born into a modest family of little significance, but by the time he died in 1227 CE around the age of 65, Temujin had left his mark upon the world. The empire he created, the Mongol Empire, would go on to become one of the most powerful and feared empires the world has ever seen. As the founder of that empire, one that would conquer nearly 1/5 of all the land on Earth, the name Temujin has become immortal. So too is the title he took on after having unified the Mongols: Genghis Khan. So Temujin, Genghis Khan, he's kind of a big deal, which makes his absence in fate feel like a gaping hole just waiting to be filled. But instead of asking why he hasn't been added as a servant yet, let's instead look at what a hypothetical Temujin servant might be like. Class? There are several good options here. The Mongols were legendary for their prowess with the bow and on horseback, skills that Temujin himself demonstrated in life. So both archer and rider would be solid choices in my opinion. Indeed, as the founder of the most infamous army of horsemen in human history, there's a strong case for Genghis being a candidate for Grand Rider. There are other options aside from these two. I made a point of going into detail about Temujin's early life for several reasons, but the biggest one was to emphasize how he was a man who suffered at the hands of his environment, and so spent the rest of his life trying to change that environment. A younger Temujin, one who has suffered and is trying to destroy the world that hurt him and his family, I see potential for the Avenger class there. Lastly, there is another class that might work for Temujin. Again, the way I told Temujin's story earlier was a very deliberate choice. When people think of Genghis Khan today, they think of his empire, and the frightful toll it took upon its neighbors. This should not be downplayed. Exact numbers are impossible to verify, but the Mongol Empire might have killed as many as 40 million people during their century-long spree of conquest. Genghis was only around for part of that, but that still makes him responsible for a body count comparable to the 3 biggest monsters of the 20th century, the 2 mustache men and that guy who never brushed his teeth. Again, this should not be downplayed. I've heard this mentioned as a reason why Genghis has yet to be added to fate, that a guy responsible for this much carnage deserves to be condemned, not turned into some kind of quirky anime characters. But for those of you who feel that way, let me present another idea. Temujin's family was abandoned on the steppe, left to die by those who should have been looking out for the widow and children of their fallen chieftain. Temujin did his best to just live his own life, but eventually, when it became clear after his wife Borte was kidnapped that the world was not going to let him or his family live in peace, Temujin spent the rest of his life doing whatever it took to ensure that his family would never have to suffer again. It reminds me of characters we have seen plenty of times in fiction, perhaps most famously Michael Corleone or Walter White, a man who sees his family put in danger and resolves to do what it takes to protect them. But, like those 2 fictional examples, instead of just keeping his own family safe, Temujin would become Genghis Khan, a monster whose victims number in the millions. Though, unlike those two fictional examples, Temujin would still keep his own family intact, at least while he was alive. But to put it all another way, Temujin tried to make the world safe for his family, only to make the world extremely unsafe for countless other families. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yurie, are you trying to make a case for Genghis Khan to be a beast, an evil of humanity? Yes, I am. For those of you who think someone like Genghis Khan is too big of a monster to be added to Fate, maybe making him one of the franchise's most dangerous villains would make for a good compromise. To bring him into Fate, but still make it clear just how dangerous this guy truly was. But even if you don't make Genghis Khan a beast, framing his story in that way is still a solid choice for his characterization, to make him a man who does his best for his family, and later his followers. Temujin rewarded those who were loyal and proved their worth, looked after the families of the fallen, ensured that loot would be distributed evenly, that everyone on his side would benefit. There are things to admire in all this, things you can find virtue in, but it also has to be balanced against the staggering human cost of the ruthlessness of Mongol conquest. Was the Shah of the Khwarezm Empire wrong to let Mongol merchants be murdered, then to murder Genghis's ambassador who came to ask why? Yes. But did the Khwarezm Empire deserve to be destroyed, to have its cities burned to the ground, to have the skulls of its citizens piled into mountains outside the ruins? That's a bit much. Temujin wouldn't be the first conqueror with a high body count in the Fate franchise. But I guess the difference is that while people like Iskandar and Caesar are known to have had some dark episodes, with Genghis, the Mongols were infamous for killing huge numbers of people, and then using that reputation as a weapon against their enemies. Actually, that might be a good segue into talking about skills. What kind of skills might a hypothetical Temujin servant get? Well, a charisma skill is an obvious, if unimaginative one. Temujin was leading his own tribe before the age of 20, and he did things differently from others. And that different approach, the opportunity for advancement even if you didn't come from a noble family, the promise of getting a share of the loot instead of only what you yourself could grab off of a battlefield, the reassurance that if you fell in battle, your family would be looked after. There are many reasons why so many were inspired to join Temujin, even before he became the greatest power in Mongolia. As for what this charisma skill might be called, well, in what is likely to be a recurring theme both in this video and in future videos in this series, I'm not the best at naming things. Concepts I can come up with, but actually naming them, I'm not good at that. Maybe something like Khan of all Mongols, or Universal Ruler, the latter being one idea for what the name Genghis Khan meant. A second skill idea is, okay, it's kind of an excuse to give Temujin an MP charge, but it is at least based upon a real thing. As Temujin started to make a name for himself as a small but notable warlord, shamans of the Tengri religion began to talk about him, to say that Temujin had a great destiny ahead of him. Though the Mongols were famous for their tolerance towards other religions, on a personal level, Genghis Khan took the Tengri faith pretty seriously. It is said that he would look to the heavens before making key decisions, such as the many invasions the Mongols would conduct. And, later on, Genghis Khan would come to be seen as having been chosen by Tengri to rule the Mongols, and the rest of the world. Anyway, this is admittedly my weakest idea for a skill, but as something that might justify Genghis getting an MP charge, a skill perhaps called Blessing of Tengri, maybe this could work. From here on, I'm not entirely sure which of these ideas should be skills, Temujin's MP, or even just bonus effects added to other skills or the MP. Even those first two skills I mentioned could be thrown out in favor of one of the other 5 remaining ideas I have. Anyway, let's go through them, these ideas for either a third skill or Temujin's MP. First, there's one I'm tentatively calling Diplomatic Immunity, based upon how Genghis Khan put great emphasis upon the well-being of his ambassadors. That if you killed a messenger from the Khan, well, I already mentioned the infamous example of the Khwarezm Empire. They murdered some Mongol traders, Genghis sent some ambassadors to demand restitution, only for the Shah to murder his ambassadors. In response, the Mongols killed at least 1 million people, wiped cities off the map, and today, The Khwarezm Empire is best remembered as those idiots who killed Genghis Khan's ambassadors. So how might this work as an ability? Well, my thinking is that Genghis would target one of his party members, give them a buff designating that person as being one of his ambassadors. Anytime that character is attacked by the enemy, Genghis immediately hits that enemy with a brutal counterattack, kinda like Bazet's MP, except to have it work on enemies attacking one of Genghis's allies rather than Genghis himself. On a related note, even if this isn't a skill or MP, this should at least play a role in Genghis's characterization. That, though he is a crazy conqueror who will inflict horrible violence upon his enemies, on a personal level, Temujin is polite and puts great emphasis on courtesy and decorum, his first instinct being to try to make deals with people rather than just murdering them. It is only if they not only reject his proposals, but do so in a rude or hostile manner, that those people then learn just how terrifying Genghis can truly be. This next skill/possible MP idea is one that portrays probably the most classic of Mongol battle tactics, that of the feigned retreat. One of the favorite things for the Mongols to do was to attack, then turn away from their enemy, making it seem like they were running away. But once the enemy gave chase, the Mongols would use the superior speed of their horses to then go around the flanks of their enemies. Their enemy would find themselves completely surrounded, being shot to pieces by arrows coming from all directions. It would certainly make for a cool visual, but to be perfectly honest, I'm a little hesitant suggesting this as an MP because, well, I'm trying very hard not to suggest MPs that are too similar to the MPs of other Fey characters, particularly Iskandar. Because while I think Ionioi Hetairoi is a fantastic MP, I feel like I shouldn't just copy it for other Conqueror-like characters. There should be at least something that makes it different. Hence why, if Genghis was to get an MP that involved having his army show up, it should at least have something unique, or specific to the sorts of tactics the armies of the Khan actually used. Relating to this, another possible idea is, rather than summoning an army, you could instead have Genghis summon his leading commanders. Genghis Khan had many commanders, but 4 specifically stand out. They were called his Dogs of War, the 4 best commanders who led the Khan's armies: Jebe, Kublai, not to be confused with his own grandson, Gelne, and Subutai. So, if the developers felt like Genghis summoning his army is a bit too close to Iskandar's MP, even if they used Mongol-specific tactics like the feigned retreat I described, well, he could always just summon these 4 instead. With that said, if they do add Genghis Khan to Fate, chances are he won't be coming alone. They may want to add at least 1 or 2 other figures from the Mongol Empire to go with him. And if they were going to add a less famous but still awesome character to fight alongside Genghis, Jebe and Subutai would be top contenders, particularly Subutai, since not only was he one of Genghis Khan's best commanders, he would actually live for another 2 decades after Temujin's death. By the time that he died in 1248 CE, Subutai had waged war from as far west as Hungary to as far east as China. There is no general in history who has conquered more land in a single lifetime than Subutai. So yeah, while the idea of Temujin summoning his 4 Dogs of War could work as his MP, that might not work if they plan to add Subutai or Jebe as servants alongside him. My last 2 skill or MP ideas are, well, dark. First is the legend of how the Mongols would build mountains of skulls outside of the cities they destroyed, a way to demonstrate their ruthlessness and as a warning of what would happen to those who resisted. This probably didn't actually happen in real life, but it's certainly become a part of their legend, like Nero playing the lyre while Rome burned around him. While FGO already has some pretty gruesome MP animations out there, like Maonobu or the various Bakumatsu-era servants, building a giant pile of skulls might be a bit too much. If it is, they could always just make a Genghis MP be a display of mass destruction, a line of catapults breaking down a wall, only for a horde of riders to storm through and set everything ablaze. This MP idea is more to emphasize the Mongols' reputation for destruction, and so is a better fit for a darker take on Temujin, like if they really did want to make him a beast. The last idea I have is even darker than that, to the point that I hesitate to even bring it up. You would only add an ability like this if you were blatantly trying to depict Genghis as a villain. No, I'm not about to bring the Black Death into this. The legend of how the Mongols catapulted plague victims into a city during a siege. Then ships leaving that port ended up spreading the plague throughout Europe. That was over a century after Temujin's death. But something else the Mongols were notorious for was the use of human shields. Being taken prisoner by Genghis Khan was not a fate you wanted to have happen, because when the Mongols would assault cities, they would often send prisoners ahead as the first wave, to soak up arrows before the real Mongol troops entered the fray. Something like this would basically work as a taunt skill, except to have it applied to an enemy, so that an enemy's attacks would hit one of their own allies. Again, I am fully aware of how dark this is, probably too much so for FGO. But if the devs wanted to portray Genghis Khan and the Mongols as being particularly brutal or cruel, this is an option. Okay, the only two things left for me to talk about are character design and characterization, in theory at least. In practice, I feel that character design is outside of my domain. I have no talent for art, and so I only have two things to say here. One, try to make Temujin at least look like a Mongol Khan. Have him wear clothing that looks the part for at least one of his ascension forms. Second, I'd prefer if they didn't gender flip Genghis Khan. But if they did decide to flip Temujin, they would probably do so by making use of a story about a character they have already gender flipped, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, aka Ushiwakamaru. The short version is that, rather than committing seppuku after being betrayed by his brother Yoritomo, Yoshitsune instead escaped to the Asian mainland, where he would take on a new name, Temujin. Yoshitsune was born only 3 years before Temujin, so it's a fun idea to entertain. But this isn't an old legend. It's a story some guy cooked up in the 19th century, and so fate probably shouldn't use it, not for a character as famous as Genghis Khan. As for characterization, I've already mentioned several bits throughout this video that I think would be important to include for a good portrayal of Genghis Khan. Making him a brutal warlord who terrifies his enemies isn't hard, but if you wanted to do him right, you would need to include other things. Details about the struggles Temujin went through in his early years, the emphasis he placed upon meritocracy, on trying to build a new, better world for his people, and how much importance he placed upon courtesy and the well-being of his ambassadors, just to name a few. How I would portray Temujin is as someone who is unquestionably brutal in his methods, but who also has things to admire, things that would convince others to side with him. But what's perhaps more interesting to explore is not just what Temujin's personality might be like, but how he would interact with characters we already have in Fate. If I had to name one character who would serve as a great foil for Temujin, it's Iskandar. Because while on the surface the two of them are pretty similar, they're actually very different people. Iskandar was the son of a king, commanded an army that was built by his father, and most of his campaigns were against foreign enemies. Temujin, by contrast, though his father was a chieftain, ultimately he was a self-made man, who built his own clan, his own army, his own system, and about half of all of his wars were spent fighting to create a new Mongolia, only afterwards going abroad to fight foreign enemies. While Iskandar might admire Genghis for his skill, force of personality, and the legacy he left behind, Temujin would probably view Iskandar with contempt, as someone who was born into privilege and freely took advantage of all the opportunities that afforded him, that Iskandar merely used what other people built for him, rather than creating something new himself. I also expect that Genghis might take issue with Iskandar claiming the title of King of Conquerors, because while Temujin didn't win every battle he fought like Alexander did, he did conquer far more land. Lastly, and perhaps most crucially, Iskandar's conquest collapsed after his death, leading to civil war and the murder of his family. Genghis's empire, on the other hand, was passed down to his descendants, who would continue to conquer and expand for another century. As for his potential interactions with other characters, I suspect that Temujin wouldn't get along very well with any servants who were rulers of nations, especially those from nations that the Mongols conquered, Qin Shi Huang, Wu Zetian, or Anastasia, even if Anastasia was never actually a ruler herself. The key thing to remember is that Genghis Khan was a disruptor, a man who tore down the established order and built his own. In other words, a bit of a revolutionary. In that regard, he might get along well with characters who were similarly disruptive during their own lifetimes. Napoleon, Oda Nobunaga, Zhang Jue, and others like them. Not Spartacus, though. He would approve of the rebelling, but would then probably see Genghis as only having replaced the old oppressor to become a new one. I'm sure you can come up with many more ideas aside from these ones. These are just the first ones I thought of. Anyway, I should probably wrap this up. I've actually said way more than I expected to for this video. But considering who I am talking about, perhaps that shouldn't be a surprise. Temujin, or Genghis Khan, is one of the most infamous figures in world history, who went from the son of a minor chieftain on the steppe to ruler of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. His legacy is certainly a bloody one, which might have something to do with why he hasn't appeared in Fate yet. But really, I see his inclusion in the Fate franchise as being inevitable. It may not happen tomorrow, but a character with an impact like Temujin can't be ignored forever. I look forward to the day when we might be able to summon him, or at least fight against him in a future story. Alright, that was my first go at this. The idea for making a video series on the characters who I'd like to see in the Fate franchise has been cooking for quite a while, but it kept getting put off as I'd always feel compelled to work on the next video in the Accuracy series. But in the light of my subscriber count having reached 5 digits, I thought it would be a good time to finally get this series off the ground. Anyway, what did you think? Do you find this sort of video to be interesting? Let me know in the comments. As for future videos in this series, I've got plenty more ideas. For the next one, I'm thinking of going to Africa, a continent that has been totally neglected by Fate outside of Egypt. Which is a real shame too, because there are several figures from Africa who are worthy of being made into servants. And the person I have in mind would not be unknown to servants we already have. After all, throughout its 2,200-year-long history, few enemies of the Roman Empire put them in quite as much danger as this guy did. Time and again, he was told what he wanted to do was impossible. But he found a way, or he made one. Anyway, that's all for the teaser. Until next time,